Okay, so for today's lesson, we're going to learn about masking inside of After Effects. In fact, we're actually going to learn how to animate masks and make them move. Along with that, we're going to learn how masks control visibility. Basically, this text is on the screen, but the mask is covering part of it, and notice how we animate it to reveal the text. So we're going to learn how to do that. We're also going to learn how to animate this little cursor. Notice that it only animates in one direction. We're going to learn how to create a cool looking gradient background, and I'll show you some layer style options. So if you're trying to make your text stand out a little bit, there are some very easy and quick styles that you can add to get some interesting effects. So let's go ahead and hop in to After Effects. So we'll come over here and create a new project, and I'm going to go ahead and hit File, Save As. It's always a good idea to save your project right off the bat so that you know where it's going to be and that you can access it if it crashes. So we'll go ahead and save this project as animating text in AE, and I'm going to save it into this folder, and now I'm ready to go. So since everything we're creating for this project comes from After Effects, we don't need to use any footage. So we're going to go right to the new comp icon right here. That brings up this comp settings window. We can call this composition animating text in AE. And then we can come down to presets. Now, presets are essentially lots of different ways that you can format your screen and your frame rate before you even get started. Basically, most of these are not things you would want to use. But in this class, we're going to be working with HD TV 1080-24. If you're in Europe, I imagine you might use 25. And if you want to get a more video look, you might opt for 29.97. The reason we are going with 24 is because 24 frames is just simply less frames to render. And therefore, it's going to be less work for our computer. And generally speaking, most of the projects I work on are in 24 frames a second. If you're working with another crew, make sure that the project's frame rate matches what you're working on in After Effects. So again, HDTV 1080-24. And that's going to give us everything we need. Now we just need to come down and set the duration. Let's give this 10 seconds. We're not going to worry about the background color because we're going to set our own. So let's click OK. All right, so now we have a comp. We don't have any layers yet, so let's go ahead and knock out that gradient background first. Now, if you're familiar with After Effects, you might know that there is the option to go Layer, New, Solid. Now, that's a really cool and easy and fast way to get a solid color in your background, but unfortunately it doesn't give us the option to create a gradient. So we won't be using that option. Instead, we're going to be using the rectangle tool. Now, if you've ever used the rectangle tool, it's basically a shape tool. You can come over here and drag out shapes and make lots of rectangles. But in this case, we want it to fill the whole screen. And rather than even coming over here and trying to manually drag out this rectangle, I'm going to take advantage of a setting in After Effects that allows me to double click on this rectangle tool and it will fill the screen. But it's not the color we're going for, and it's not the gradient we're going for. So if we come up to our fill and stroke options, there's actually 4 options up here. There's fill type, which I can access by clicking on the word fill. And you'll see my fill options show up. I have the option for no fill if I just want to create a stroke. I have the option for solid, linear gradient, or radial gradient. And that's what we're going to go for here. So if I click radial gradient, you'll notice that we get a background color and this little circle and this little handle right here. Let's go ahead and modify these colors first, and then I'll show you how the handle works. So if we click on the color next to the word fill, we get the gradient editor. Now this only comes up when you choose a gradient option, but what we're seeing here is a line with 2 color stops. What I generally do is the one on the left is going to be the center color. So if I set the center color to a light green by clicking this little button and then picking my color, And then come over here, and I'm going to set the darker color. Let's drag this back down to green, and we'll pick something a little more lime green, like that. Looks like those colors are a little too close together, so we're going to need a much lighter green here. So we'll drag this over to the lighter area and maybe even go a touch darker on the outside. There we go. Now we can see we've got two separate colors. And of course, if I wanted to add in more colors, all I have to do is just click anywhere here and it will add in a new color stop. So if I wanted something like that, I could create it, but if I don't want it, I can select it and delete it. Okay, so now I've got a gradient background. I like the way it looks. Got a nice hot spot in the middle, which is going to draw your eye in. So I'm going to come over to the layer, I'm going to click on it, and I'm going to hit the return key and call it BG for background. Okay, now it's time to create some text. So we'll go up to the text tool. With the text tool, I'm just going to click and write the words reveal. All right, and come over to the right side of our screen and click the align window. If I click that window, I can access the horizontal alignment and the vertical alignment. So I'll be using the character window to pick my font, my color, and things like that. If you've used any text generators in Adobe, this will be pretty familiar. But in order to make any changes to this text, I have to highlight it first. Now, I could come down here with the text tool and try to click and sort of do it manually, which is a bit of a pain. It's a heck of a lot easier to just double click on the layer, and that automatically selects everything. And then I can come up here and scale it up, change the color, do whatever I want. Let's go ahead and create our cursor. Now you'll remember from the intro animation that the cursor essentially motivates the text to write on. And we can see that it grows vertically. It's just a rectangle, and then it passes over the text as though it's typing on, and then disappears. In order to do that, we're going to go back to the rectangle tool. This time we're not going to double click on it. Now here's a really important thing about the rectangle tool. Once we're done creating our cursor, we're also going to create a mask. Now the rectangle tool creates both rectangles and other shapes, of course, and it creates masks. Now the way you create a mask with the rectangle tool is you make sure another layer is selected first. So if I click the word reveal, I'm just showing you this, and I come over here with the rectangle tool, you can see that it's creating a mask. We're not getting a solid shape. We're basically masking out part of the text. You can also see right here that a mask has been created on my text layer. We'll take a look at that in a second. But that's a really easy mistake to make if you're not expecting it. So make sure you click off your text layer and then come over to the rectangle tool and of course select it and just come down here and drag out a rectangle. Now, a couple things are happening that we need to be aware of. First off, our gradient is still coloring our rectangle, the same one we used for the background. That's not a big problem. We'll fix that in a second. But what can be a problem, and what is a problem, is this anchor point right here. So an anchor point is a point with which something scales or rotates around. So if I come over to the shape layer and I hit S for scale, you'll see that when I scale it up and down, it's scaling sort of towards that anchor point and away from it. Okay, that's not going to let me build the animation that I'm trying to build here. So it's really important that I move that anchor point into the middle of my shape. And to do that, I can just grab the anchor point tool, also known as the pan behind tool. I can select this little bullseye right here, which is our anchor point, and I can drag it right to the middle of my cursor. And now you can see that when I adjust the scale, it's adjusting from that point. Okay, now let's go ahead and tackle the color issue. If we select the shape layer and we go to the shape tool, you'll see that it's still set to gradient fill. We can fix that by clicking on the word fill and just setting it back to solid. Now, mine is matching this color, but it's not quite matching it right, so I want to actually fix this color so it's the same as the text. And to do that, I'm just going to click on the color square and use the eyedropper right here. This is a tool that samples colors and essentially loads them into your color picker. So by clicking right there in the middle, I get that slightly lighter orange and I'm good to go. Looking at our cursor right here, in fact, let's go ahead and take a second and click on the word shape layer, hit the return key, and type in cursor. All right, now we have all of our layers labeled, which just makes life easier in After Effects. Let's get this cursor looking the way we want it to look. And I'm going to do that by hitting S for scale. Now, it might be a little bit taller and maybe just a touch thicker than I want it to be. So I can use scale to change those things, but I don't want it to scale evenly from height and width. I want to be able to control the height and width separately. Now, all I need to do that is click on this little chain link right here, and that unlocks these two parameters. So now I can make it a little bit thinner and maybe a little bit shorter. And now that I see it's shorter, I want it even more thin. And that looks good right there. I'm also going to move its position to the right, and I'm going to do that using the arrow keys on my keyboard. It's a great way to nudge something just a little bit. It's almost, easier than coming up and grabbing the selection tool and dragging it around. Okay, now if I click off, I can see that looks pretty decent. So let's go ahead and animate it. So let's go ahead and drag our playhead out to 1 second. That's where we want this to grow into existence. So at 1 second, I don't want this to be visible. I want it to be completely shrunk down. So since I want it to grow vertically and not horizontally, the only parameter that I'm going to be animating is the y-axis. This is the x, this is the y. This is vertical, this is horizontal. So I'm going to go ahead and just type in a 0 and hit return. And that basically sets the vertical down to 0. And I'm going to hit the stopwatch next to the word scale. That's basically dropping a keyframe at 1 second saying basically be at 0. So now we'll go ahead and drag the playhead to 2 seconds. And I think I had it at 89%. Let's go ahead and type in 89 and hit return. That looks good. The fact that we moved the playhead and typed in a new value automatically created a second keyframe. And we can see that it grows vertically just like we want it to. Now the next thing we want it to do is move across the text. So we're going to be animating position. So we can go ahead and hit the P key. Now I want this to start right when this finishes growing on. I know that's at 2 seconds, but if you ever forget, you'll notice that as soon as I hit P, the scale keyframes disappeared. If you ever want to get those back, just hit the U key. Okay, and that way you can be sure, okay, I'm starting right on top of the second scale keyframe, which is where I want this motion to begin. So again, I'm going to hit P key, and I'm going to add a keyframe for position, because this is where I want it to be when it starts to animate. I'm going to go ahead and drag the playhead to 4 seconds, and I'm just simply going to drag the X value to the right until I have gone across the entire bit of text and landed with sort of a similar spacing to where I started. I can always go back and double check, and just by scrubbing across here I can see that we've created an animation. We have a motion path, which is letting us know there's an animation there, and it's looking good so far. So at this point, we need the cursor to shrink back down. Now here's the thing, I don't want any change in the size of the cursor between here and here. So I don't want to type in a new value to get that keyframe. I basically want it to drop a keyframe that's the same as this one right here. And that way there won't be any change in between those keyframes. So at this point, I could literally hit this keyframe button. You'll see it drops a keyframe. And then I could come over to 5 seconds and change this value to 0 and hit return. And it essentially grows back down. But there's a faster way to do that. But you'll find that animation can be a very time-consuming process. So rather than creating new keyframes, what I like to do is look at what I've already done. And what I've already done is animated this cursor to grow, which means by reversing these keyframes, it would shrink. Now, copying and pasting keyframes is a really important way to save time. So rather than reanimating it using numbers and dropping keyframes, I'm simply going to grab this keyframe right here, the one that says be at full size. I'm going to hit Command C to copy it. I'm going to drag the playhead over to 4 seconds, and I'm going to hit Command V to paste it. So now we have that third keyframe. There's no change in size between these two keyframes, but there is a change in size between these two. So if I want that same change in size at the end, I can simply grab this first keyframe, Command C to copy, Command V to paste. And I've essentially basically copied these two keyframes and just reversed their order. So instead of growing up, once it gets to here, it shrinks down. So once you start to take advantage of reusing existing keyframes rather than creating new ones, you'll see your animation time speed up considerably. But if you're still new to this and it's still a little overwhelming, I get it. Take your time. Feel free to create the keyframes as you need them. I'll show you another example at the end about how we can copy and paste keyframes. But now that we have our cursor animating, growing and moving and shrinking, we can go ahead and mask this text. So first thing we need to do is select our text, because in order to mask out a layer, you have to have that layer selected. Again, I'm going to go up to the rectangle tool here and watch what I do. I'm going to click on the rectangle tool, and I'm going to come over and pretty much get it right up against the edge of my cursor. If you need to zoom in a little bit, you can hit Command plus. There's no point in working all zoomed out if you're just working on the center of your screen. So I'm going to go ahead and put the rectangle tool right there and click and drag. And you can see that it's revealing my text. It's not masking out my text right now. Okay. So we have a mask, but it's kind of not doing what we want it to do. That's an easy fix. Okay. So when we create this mask on our screen, if we go down to the text layer and open it up, or hit the M key, it will show us our mask. And here it is right here. If I click on it, you can see it selects the mask path. Currently, it is set to add, which means it's going to add whatever's inside of the mask. We want the opposite. We could invert it, but a better way to do it is just hit the drop down and choose subtract. You can see now that it's subtracted everything inside of our mask. So the mask is now doing what we want it to do, but we want it to move with that cursor so that it reveals the text as the cursor goes across it. Before we do that, let's go ahead and take a quick look at this mask on our layer. If I close it and reopen it, you'll see that there's the mask. Notice that it's got this color outline, which isn't terribly easy to see on this background. So I can click on this little light blue color next to the word mask, and I can change it to something like dark red, which should stand out a little more, make my life a little easier. So clicking on that box allows you to change the mask color. We have 4 things in here. We have mask path, which is this actual box right here. This is the shape and path of our mask. We have the ability to feather it. We have the ability to adjust its opacity so that we can see into the mask. If it was set to add, that would work better. There you go. You can see when it's set to add, opacity works. When it's set to subtract, opacity does not work. And you'll also see there is a mask expansion. This is really helpful if you need to make your mask just a little bit bigger or smaller. If I make it smaller, you can see that little rectangle inside is the actual mask now. So those are your settings inside of there. Let's go ahead and animate this mask path, because that is what we need to move. We need to move this mask off of our text. And we want to do it at the same rate that this cursor is moving across our screen. So we know that the cursor begins to move at 2 seconds. So we'll put our playhead right there. We're going to click a stopwatch for mask path because we're going to animate it to move to the right with the cursor. Now we know that the cursor ends at 4 seconds. So all we need to do now is select our mask path and move it to this edge of the cursor at 4 seconds. Now, if I hit the V key, that's going to give me the selection tool, and I can come up and grab this mask and move it over. If I move it over to there, and also make sure that you have set the cursor to 4 seconds. Now you can see that that mask is animating its position to move from there to there. All right, just to show you that one more time. All right, we have our mask covering our text. There's our cursor. We know that the cursor moves left to right for exactly 2 seconds. So we want our mask to do the same thing. And again, we're going to animate the mask path. We'll click stopwatch at 2 seconds. We'll move our playhead to 4 seconds. And we will use the selection tool to then move the mask to here. And again, if I back it up now, you can see that that mask is pretty much attached to that cursor. Okay, let me butt in here for just a second. So I showed you guys how we can move this mask, but I kind of left out one very important section. And that's the fact that this mask doesn't have to move like a shape. We can deform this mask. Okay, and so you'll notice right now, if I grab the mask path and I move it, the entire shape moves. I hit Command Z to undo that. But check this out. Notice how we've got these 4 corners here, and one of them has an additional square around it. This is like the control point. Now, the reason I say that is because if I hold down Shift and I click on that point, you see it goes hollow. And now, notice what happens when I move the mask. Now you'll also notice that after moving that, all of these became hollow. So the fact is, I could animate this project by moving the entire mask. Or I could simply just squish the mask down to basically being as thick as a line. Let me delete these keyframes off the mask path real quick here, and I'll show you what I mean. So we've already seen that we can do it as a shape, but if I add a keyframe here, so again, here's my first keyframe that just says look like this, and then I jump forward to 4 seconds. So check this out. I can, again, shift click this corner so that it's hollow, and then by clicking on it again, it makes the rest of these hollow. And now I could simply do this. Now it's essentially doing the exact same thing, right? It's getting the mask off the text. So I just wanted to show you that again, you can move the entire mask. If these are solid, all 4 of them, you can move it just by clicking and dragging it. But if you hold Shift and click on this one, and then grab these points, you can move them individually and get, like I said, the same result. It's just more tools in your tool bag. Okay, back to you, Scott. You know, one mistake that I see a lot of new students make is they end up getting little gaps between the mask and the cursor, and it kind of reveals some text when you don't want it to. So just make sure if your cursor starts moving at 2 seconds that your mask also starts moving at 2 seconds. And if you're not sure, hit the U key. Because if I select all my layers and hit the U key, I can actually see the keyframes for the cursor and make sure that the mask is right beneath them. Now, if I feel like this is too slow, I can always just select all of those keyframes and maybe speed it up by a ½ second. And as long as I move them together, you'll notice that we don't get any gaps between the mask and the cursor. It really does appear to be drawing it on. And then it shrinks and goes away. And that's essentially the animation right there. Now, You'll also notice that these are what we call linear keyframes. And what that means is that everything is growing at an exact pace. It never speeds up or slows down. It just grows at a consistent rate from there to there. It also moves at a consistent rate from left to right. And it shrinks down at a consistent rate. Those are called linear keyframes. Now, it's not very natural looking. In fact, it's pretty robotic looking. So one thing that we like to do in After Effects when we're all done with these types of animations is select all your keyframes. And if you have a keyboard with an FN button on it, a function button, you can hold down function F9 and it will convert all of these into easy ease keyframes. It'll essentially ease the motion in and out. Unfortunately, I don't have that keyboard, so I'm going to have to right-click with all these selected and go down to Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. It's going to ease the motion of all of those keyframes. So I'll go ahead and click that. First thing you'll notice is that now the keyframes look like these little hourglasses. But when we see it play back, it's going to take off slow, speed up, and then ease to a stop. So let's watch it one more time. Okay, so especially watching that cursor moving from left to right, you can see that it does speed up and then kind of ease to a stop. Now the last thing I want to do before we wrap this up is just show you a couple really simple ways you can add some style to this animation. Again, it's perfectly fine the way it is, but if you're looking for something a little bit more, a very easy thing you can do is add some layer styles. If you've used Photoshop, these are taken directly from Photoshop. So if I select my text layer and I go up to Layer, Layer Styles, you'll see a bunch of things. Again, these are straight from Photoshop. They added these so that if you have these in a Photoshop file, you can still edit them in After Effects. They used to get baked in, but this way they remain editable. And if we come to something like a drop shadow, right? You know, pretty standard, pretty common. Probably not a whole lot you need to do to this, but we're getting a pretty, noticeable hard edge drop shadow right there. It looks good. But if you want something that's a little less defined, you can come down here and play with the spread and the size. I tend to make the spread very small and the size very big, and then you get a much sort of, just a different style of drop shadow. Looks pretty nice. And again, maybe it works for you, maybe it doesn't. It's totally up to you. And again, it just gives me a sort of a less distinct, specific drop shadow. Notice it looks kind of weird not having that on the cursor. So, in the same way that I like to copy and paste keyframes, rather than selecting the cursor and trying to match those settings, what I'd much rather do is just come down to the reveal layer, come down to where it says Layer Style, select it, Command C to copy, go to the cursor layer and paste it using Command V. And now I've got that matching effect on both. Let's go ahead and trim this comp down. So let's go ahead and grab this little blue work area end button and let's drag it back to the 5-second mark. And that's going to basically not allow us to go past 5 seconds. Now that we've got our out point and our in point defined with our work area, we can right click on this bar right here and choose Trim Comp to Work Area, because we really don't need this extra 5 seconds at the end. Okay, and now that we've got that done, all we need to do is export this. So to export it, we're going to go to File, Export, Add to Render Queue. In this case, we don't want to use Media Encoder. We just want to do a one-off export, and so Add to Render Queue is going to be just fine. Now, as we get down to these settings, the good news is you won't have to mess with these every time you do this. In fact, your render settings, leaving these at best settings is fine. The only thing you may need to change is your output module, and you'll have to give it a title and tell it where to save it to. So let's take a quick look at output module. Right now it's set to high quality. If I open this up you will see, and I'm just hitting the little drop down right there. Okay, so output module. Basically, what do you want to wrap this in? And what type of codec do you want to use to compress it? Now, right now it says high quality. If we open this up, you will see there's alpha only, there's audio only, high quality with alpha. So if we didn't have a background, we would choose high quality with alpha. And that way we could lay it over a clip and it would just read the text. Now, lossless is going to give us Apple's animation codec. And I've used this for years. Let's double check that I'm still correct here. Yeah. So if I set it to lossless, which is what I've always used, it gives us the animation codec. The problem I'm running into is that new Apple Silicon can't read the animation codec. So I have years of After Effects projects that I exported using this codec because it's lossless. And if you think about it, most animations end up being added to Premiere projects, which are going to get compressed at the end of their exporting process. So you don't want your animations to get compressed twice. Therefore, we use a lossless codec. But unfortunately, as I said, in 2022, as of September 9th, Apple has not made the lossless codec compatible with Apple Silicon, which is what I'm on. Therefore, I can't use it. Or at least if I do use it, it's going to create some problems. So in this case, despite the fact that I want to use the animation codec, I'm going to set it to something like Apple ProRes, which is a very high quality, low loss codec. And if I set it to Apple ProRes and click OK, that is going to give me a codec that Apple Silicon can read. So I'll click OK. And you'll notice that now it's defaulting to QuickTime. So again, this is your list of codecs, and choosing lossless is unfortunately not an option if you're on a new Mac. So what you need to do is actually click on the word custom and go into, now make sure it says Format QuickTime, and then go to Format Options. And under Format Options, you'll see Video Codec Apple ProRes 422. By choosing this, it will default to this from now on, and I don't have to come in here and make this change every single time I export. Only have to do it once. Okay, so now that I've got the output module set properly, all I have to do is tell it where to save it and what to call it. So I'll click on this right here, and since I already have a folder with the project, I'll call this, I could actually just click on the title and that would automatically fill it in. Since it's a .mov file and not a .aep, it won't overwrite anything, and I can go ahead and choose Save. And again, just to be clear, I'm saving this into the animating text folder that I already created. And once you've done that, you can hit Render. And the nice thing about Apple Silicon is it goes pretty fast. Now if I come over here to this window and I choose my export and hit the space bar, Apple will play it back for me. And if I'm happy, I can send it to my client.